Response videos, am I right? I usually stay clear of breaking my no repeat subjects back to back or within a 9-month time period rule, but today we're making an exception. I'm covering Etheri0n, the subject of Minor Arcana number 7, yet again. So to catch all of you up to speed on why I'm doing this, context. So all discussion within this video surrounds the 2 anime adaptations of the popular manga known as Full Metal Alchemist, and we'll be talking major spoilers for both anime, so if you haven't watched either one, go ahead and watch them both, they're both great. The first anime in question is known as Full Metal Alchemist, though generally referred to with the suffix 2003 or 03, and the other is known as Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. Both anime are different in their approach to telling the story of the manga. 2003 adapts the first few volumes, but eventually branches off from the manga to tell its own story. Brotherhood, for the most part, is a straight adaptation of the manga material. Both are very popular, but Brotherhood has a larger following of the two, and is my preferred version. This leads us into the discussion that started in Minor number 7. In November 2020, YouTuber Etheri0n released a video known as Taking Brotherhood Down a Peg, which was a video that discussed many areas where Brotherhood was flawed. I covered that a couple months ago in Minor Arcana number 7, and Etheri0n later responded to that, and yeah, so we're covering it. No time to waste, let's begin.
Rock, paper, scissors.
Oh, Brotherhood, nowadays if somebody makes a video discussing your flaws in a raw and unfiltered way, or if an 03 fan makes a post explaining why they prefer 03 to you, and without including the obligatory phrase, I like both adaptations, their video/post will likely get bombed with dislikes right out of the gate, and that just stinks.
Okay, so like, I'm not going to pretend that this isn't possibly a thing that happens, but I'd like to imagine that this isn't nearly as true as you act like it is. I mean, it's not like you do anything more than just show 2 videos of people saying Brotherhood is trash and overrated.
Now, while I personally wish I'd used a wider pool of visual examples during this part of my video, I think you misunderstood the overall purpose of my intro here, which wasn't meant to prove to people that Brotherhood-related backlash was a thing. That would have been a topic for a whole other video entirely. And I think a good number of FMA fans in general, rightly or wrongly already believe that it is a thing though, and the purpose of my intro was to anticipate and preemptively short-circuit potential Brotherhood-related backlash so that viewers could focus on the arguments provided after this disclaimer shows up. There is no shame in liking Brotherhood. I am simply sharing my opinion on the show, as well as debunking some misinformation related to it that I've seen come up again and again in various online discussions. I hope that what I say here can be of some value to you, whether you're a Brotherhood fan or an 03 fan, or maybe you just don't care. Also, there are going to be a lot of spoilers for all of FMA. Everything after this disclaimer is what I was arguing for, and at times trying to convince people of. Everything before the disclaimer is boundary setting around the main discussion, where I got a potential hurdle out of the way to try to give the main arguments a chance. How valid the Brotherhood backlash thing is in the first place is worth looking into, but it was beyond the scope and the goal of that original video.
So, exactly one interjection in, and we're hit with a very peculiar point coming from Etheri0n. One that very fundamentally misunderstands the intentions of my point, and honestly knowing the rest of this video, perhaps the intention of my video and how I and others handle response videos in the first place. And the problems start with your opening statements. I think you misunderstood the overall purpose of my intro here, which wasn't meant to prove to people that Brotherhood-related backlash existed. This very statement in itself completely misunderstands the purpose of my criticism here, because it portrays my point as me misunderstanding that there is more to this statement than just this segment, that it was all built up for the disclaimer, which was meant to dissuade those types of people from getting up in arms about the video. The problem is that I do actually understand the overall purpose of your intro. In fact, that's actually part of what's wrong with this. Your disclaimer is built on the back of these statements that when Brotherhood is criticized, its fans seem to often get up in arms with anger and dislike bomb or ratio discussion, something that is incredibly unfair for those trying to start discussion like this. This is something that in Minor number 7 I questioned because I felt this wasn't adequately portrayed, as you only showcase 2 videos of this being the case, one of them being a video I looked into and stressed wasn't that good in the first place. While this isn't the focus of the point, it's still a glaring flaw nonetheless, no matter what it's setting up. And to really illustrate why I consider it such a flaw, this video was my first foray into any sort of FMA 03 versus FMA Brotherhood discussion, so having no experience with FMA Brotherhood fans and understanding almost immediately that these 2 videos themselves very possibly could have had some underlying flaws for them to receive such backlash incited a sense of caution within me, because I was under the impression you were saying this to make FMA Brotherhood fans look uncivil and annoying. A very bad first impression, to say the least. I think you misunderstand that me focusing on elements like this, small things within larger points, is not because I believe them to be the main point, but because they have their own set of problems that can sometimes raise questions of their own. My video isn't really about striking the heart of every point you made and taking Brotherhood down a peg, but simply pointing out problems I had with the video, which sometimes is smaller stuff.
Rock, paper, scissors.
I was going to initially just put out a skip card here and call it a day, but since the next part will be somewhat important to the next point in a way that I feel could use some elaboration, I thought I'd give you all the heads up. In minor number 7, between the last interjection you saw in the next one, I spent some time looking into one of the two videos Etheri0n showed off to get the idea of Brotherhood backlash existing. MMCA's Brotherhood is Overrated video in particular. I pointed out how the video didn't really talk about any issues other than music and comedy, which I felt contributed to the video getting backlash. But as Etheri0n points out in his video, he did mention the story and characters feeling lackluster to him, which fair, though it's worth mentioning how that is all brought up in like the last seconds of the video, but I digress. I just wanted to let you all know before we continue. Anyways, continue.
At least call the video my two biggest issues with FMA Brotherhood or something like that. Maybe people would be a little less nettled if you said that. I think it says a lot that this video here doesn't have nearly the same amount of backlash as the two videos you showed, despite you railing on Brotherhood so hard in this one. Gee, it's as if not titling your video Brotherhood is the worst anime or overrated makes people less inclined to immediately get up in arms.
Sure, maybe the title is a little less hyperbolic, but in the thumbnail, I'm straight up depicting Brotherhood Ed as a pompous and unjustifiably arrogant buffoon, while O3 Ed stands unimpressed by whatever superiority the former claims to have. Also, my tone throughout the video itself was pretty darn negative, unlike MMCA's, which was super softball and civil. I feel that all of this nullifies your point about how being confrontational affects reception.
And hey, you know what? I'd agree with that if that was at all what I was trying to get at in my original video. Look, point being, no, I wasn't saying being confrontational was responsible for MMCA's video getting any sort of backlash. What I was doing was pointing fingers specifically at the title. That's why I discuss the title, and offhandedly suggest altering it, which I feel would have made people less inclined to get up in arms. I guess to further elaborate, it's because a title like that is not only inherently more interesting to people who get uppity when you don't like something they do, therefore it's more likely to pull in a hostile audience, it sets up an expectation that the person behind the video or anything else trying to make the point that X thing is the worst thing ever or overrated better make a good point. I'd like to give you the benefit of doubt since I didn't clarify any of that in particular, but the confrontation part is completely out of left field and is taking my point in a direction I wasn't going in at all if you pay attention to my wording. Whoops. Look, I recommend you spend more time carefully paying attention to my words from now on.
I highly suspect that phrasing things the way that I did in my intro protected my video from being bombed with backlash, because in my intro I made a pretty sizable and elaborate speech about how if the relatively few but very toxic Brotherhood fans mass disliked my video simply because I held an outright negative stance on that show, they'd only be proving my point and making themselves look unreasonably petty. I think my tactic, if you can call it that, worked, and thankfully the very mature, untoxic Brotherhood fans who've interacted with me since I uploaded that video have been very kind and receptive to what
That's an interesting way to look at it, and there's nothing saying that's not possible. But even if you're not aware that I threw blame particularly at the title, I'd say it's the execution of both of your videos that is really to blame for where your videos ended up reception-wise. Starting with, I'd argue that your video is mostly well executed. Some logic is questionable if you think about it. Some points may not be as big a deal to everyone, and most troublingly, some points aren't really worded well. Trust me, I'll get to this towards the back half of this video. I wouldn't call it a 10 out of 10 video in terms of execution. Fuck, I don't even think I'd call it an 8 out of 10 video, but I feel that most audience members can at the very least understand where you're coming from and recognize that, yeah, Brotherhood does indeed have flaws. Fucking, there's a reason I only cover like a little bit of your video. Like, overall, not that bad of a video. You know, certain areas were questionable, yeah, but, you know, the main reason I covered it was because I just couldn't get it out of my head, and I thought, you know what, fuck it, I got nothing better to do, might as well just get it out of the way. Anyways, meanwhile, MMCA's video is, you know, chillin'. He's just discussing why he feels the music and comedy of the show isn't to his liking, with 5 seconds for the story and characters at the very end, but I digress. But under the guise that those elements make the show overrated, aka valued more highly than it deserves to be. Something which probably alienated the people walking in, on top of grabbing a hostile audience. I'm just saying, Yeah, I'm actually just saying. I simply wanted to point this out for you.
Rock, paper, scissors.
So even fans of Brotherhood consider its first core to be the weakest part of it, and I agree with them. But I found that a lot of folks tend to excuse the quality of these episodes with the reasoning that since the series was the second adaptation of the manga, Studio Bones naturally wanted to rush to the parts of the source material that the first adaptation didn't cover, and that was a legitimate strategy, or at least an understandable one on their part. Now, in my video, FMA 2003 is actually brilliant, by the way, go check that out if you haven't already. I briefly went into why this reasoning is deeply flawed when taken on its own merits, but I've recently found that it may also be based on false assumptions. In a 2017 interview with Anime News Network, Brotherhood series director Yasuhiro Airi went on record saying that the existence of the 2003 series didn't actually influence his creative choices on the new one at all. He says, and I quote, "The first Full Metal Alchemist anime came out in 2003 and became a huge hit. Then I got the offer to direct the next series that would coincide with the end of the manga series, and at that point I already knew how famous Full Metal Alchemist was. However, that didn't influence or affect me in the way I was going to make the series, so it really didn't prompt me to do anything different from what I've always done." The interviewer then asks him there wasn't any kind of pressure, and he answers by saying, "There wasn't pressure for me, but I was just approaching it in the same way as I usually do for any other title that I direct. I was more concerned about what would best suit this title in animation." So to be clear, according to the leading member of Brotherhood's production staff, the existence of FMA 2003 wasn't taken into account during the making of its younger, supposedly shinier sibling, meaning that the least liked part of the definitive FMA anime likely wasn't rushed on purpose to fill a quota or whatever, it was just simply made that way.
I've been trying to find ways to word this for like an hour, but honestly, I think I'll just come out and say this. I think you might be possibly misinterpreting this, or at least assuming what this means. That sounds a bit ridiculous if you read off the article, but think about the wording and the implications here. He talks about how his approach to directing FMA Brotherhood wasn't affected by the existence of 03, but this could just be referring to how he approached simply directing in the areas of tone, style of animation, etc.
This is such a weird way to interpret those words. If Brotherhood's director only meant what he said to apply to specific areas like tone and style, then he would or should have specified that, because otherwise that's not what those words mean. Even if only 10% of his work was influenced by what 03 did, to flat out say that he wasn't influenced would be misleading at best. But we're not just talking about a 10% figure here, we're talking about something as huge as the show's pacing. For an entire half season's worth of story, I don't think Airi would have simply forgotten to mention the obviously minor detail that he rushed the first 13 fucking episodes of his show because of another show's existence. That just wouldn't make sense, at least not based on this interview alone.
Wow, it's really interesting you say that, because I have the perfect counter-argument for that. Though, I'm not gonna say it to you. At least not now. Funny thing, I've already given it. In the past. What the fuck does that even mean? Your mom.
Well, it could be possible that this also meant that he was behind the way the early Brotherhood episodes were handled. There's also a possibility that he wasn't the person who made this decision. That could have easily been something the producers or writing team decided themselves, and the director simply had to go along with it.
Look, Etheri0n, I get you're new to the whole response video thing, but on top of not telling somebody that their criticisms are beyond the scope of the discussion and carefully analyzing words, another thing you need to be mindful of is not taking my points out of context. Well, actually, it's more likely you just stopped to argue this specific moment and somehow didn't realize I wasn't finished talking. Whatever. The point isn't just that he must have meant all this stuff. It's that he must have meant all this stuff because circumstances. Because of that, your argument against me just kinda dies the moment you finish it, because I explain why he would have only meant a select few areas. By the way, a part of me is seriously concerned I'll get hit with a counter along the lines of, "But Luna, you said earlier that you can make points against smaller points of arguments as long as they have flaws." It's a dumb counter because fucking... So with that out of the way, let me explain it for anyone who is confused. Etheri0n isn't criticizing a smaller section of a large point. He's criticizing one half of the larger point. Wait a minute, that sounds exactly the same. Okay, well, to be fair, that sounds like the exact same thing. So, like, when I briefly criticized the section leading into his disclaimer, I was really discussing presentation and how the examples used didn't effectively communicate the main point as much as I feel it could have. Nothing Etheri0n states after that interferes with my point. The disclaimer begins and everything's all good. Comparatively, when Etheri0n covers this section, he asks, why would this be the case at all? Something that is explained as soon as he's done arguing me. Context, what you're covering, and the point you're making in the first place matters. Honestly, at this rate, I feel less like I'm making a commentary and more like a how-to-do commentaries guide. Whew, I wish I had the convenient foresight to have thought about doing that before last April.
Sure, but based on the interview alone, that's entirely speculation on your part, especially when you consider the question just under the one I read, where Airi explicitly says the manga was the main creative guide for the entire production outside of Arakawa, like showing up for some meetings for the first few episodes, which is the only exception he ever mentioned.
The funny thing about all of this is that really, my point acknowledges this towards the end of my original interjection, as I state,
I feel what I'm saying is a bit of a what if here,
which leads into me giving you an idea why I was making this statement in the first place, which was that this was a simple possibility based on available wording, and I assume just as much as yours. But that being said, the overall idea was based upon my misconception that your point was presenting this information as all factual, the idea behind it being that you shouldn't parade it around as such if I could just hit you with that. Of course, that's not true, and somehow I realized that while editing the OG video and just didn't care to think about the implications that much. But TLDR about what I'm getting at here is that this statement that, well, your point is entirely speculation, entirely misses the point as to why it is in the first place. It's not even meant to be factual, just another possible interpretation. And I don't make it a point to make it seem like mine is more likely or anything like that, so any of the discussion that you follow this up with in an attempt to prove your point is more true is just entirely unnecessary and again, speaks to your inherent lack of understanding of what I'm getting at. Another point I'm blaming on your lack of attempt to just, well, listen to my full points. Like, if you want to attempt these video responses, the one thing you must do is listen to the full point, not cut it up the fuck whenever convenient. I don't know if this is intentional or not, but it's seriously not a good look. You know, honestly, in hindsight though, looking at the interview, it's actually also possible he just meant the fame of FMA didn't influence him in any way. Not particularly O3, but honestly, I don't even care anymore, so I'm not even gonna bother thinking about it.
I feel what I'm saying is a bit of a what if here, but I also feel at the same time what you're trying to say fits the same bill of being a what if I mean.
What? My interpretation is much closer to a literal face value reading of that quote than the one you presented. Irie said that the first adaptation didn't prompt him to do things differently when working on Brotherhood, so I concluded that it didn't. He said the manga was basically the sole creative influence for the production, so I concluded that it was. Your interpretation was one, that he was influenced by O3, even if only by a little bit, which he said he really wasn't, and two, that other members of the production were influenced by O3, which there's no positive evidence for in those quotes, and which Irie's statements about the manga positively imply isn't true.
No. You're completely misunderstanding basically everything I said. Firstly, I didn't say that he was influenced by O3 even by just a little. As I expressed 2 interjections ago, my point was, it's possible this was a decision made outside of his control by people such as producers or writers. This is something that should have become significantly more obvious when the rest of my point played out in full, but for some reason you didn't seem to notice that. You know, do you want me to start responding to individual sentences you make and repackage them as something stupider than they actually are? Because that's what it feels like, and it's not getting any more charming by the minute, Etheri0n. Secondly, on the note of the director not saying anything remotely implying other staff members were probably influenced by O3, well, first off, my words were, this could have probably been a decision made by writers or producers, not necessarily that those people were influenced by O3. These semantics would have been ignorable if it wasn't essentially repackaging my point to have a new meaning, because what I was initially saying didn't necessarily mean they were influenced by O3, but felt the need to do something like this for whatever reason that may have been, with that maybe being a possibility. Your statement at the end also absolutely baffles me. The one about the director's statements positively not implying my theory, which is goofy as all fuck when you remember an important statement from the direct is that the standard influence for the production of Brotherhood was the manga. Focus heavily on the words standard, positively not implying the 7th planet in the fucking solar system. I don't think it takes a genius to remember standard essentially means main, but it doesn't mean only. And also remember, I never stated that O3 was a major influence on other staff members. I actually didn't say anything about O3 but details. So pointing out how the manga was the main influence is not helping your point at all. Anywho, you pointing out how there isn't any concrete proof from my point shows you don't understand why I was making this point in the first place, because you assume it's me trying to argue your reading of the interview is less plausible than mine when, as I pointed out in my last interjection, it's being used to argue my misconception that you are painting this information as purely factual. Dumb comp. Actually, before I move on, I do want to talk more about Etheri0n trying to push that his reading is more true than mine, and more likely because of a couple of things. The next few moments, which I'll be skipping, has Etheri0n continuing to miss the point of basically everything I was arguing by acting as if I was pushing that my theory was more likely or factual, but it's also important to understand why I refer to his statements as a what if. The director states he wasn't influenced by O3, but that doesn't account for anyone else on the production team, and it doesn't make word of it. This is probably because, well, he wasn't asked about any other staff members but himself. Therefore, while it's very possible that what you're saying is true, what I'm saying has a good chance of being true too. Now, do I believe what I'm saying is more true? To me, it really doesn't matter. I only made this point because I thought it was important to note in your direction based on my misconception about your point.
Rock, paper, scissors.
We're watching characters who should be memorable, but aren't until quite a ways into the story. Why should I care that Havoc gets paralyzed? I barely knew the guy. Does it matter if Maria Ross apparently dies here? Because Brotherhood cared so little about her, it didn't even give her a proper introduction. If this had happened in 03, there would be reason to feel sad, because she serves as Ed's mother figure and becomes a pretty strong supporting character.
It's undeniable that Maria Ross didn't have the same amount of screen time in Brotherhood, nor the same role as she did in 03 during Brotherhood. But in spite of all that, I don't really agree with what you're trying to suggest here. Last I remember, their introduction was more or less the same between both versions, given they showed up with little fanfare in both variations of the story.
The two introduction scenes for Maria Ross are only more or less the same if you're reading dry one-sentence summaries of them on Shmoop, but they're markedly different in terms of their dramatic effect. You know, the thing that matters most when assessing the artistic merits of narrative art. Look at this close-up shot from 03 that eases the audience into her point of view, and Ed and Maria's small interaction followed by lingering shots of Maria Ross up close. These short but emotionally charged shots not only provide windows into Maria's thought process, but they also set the tone for her initial relationship with Ed and kick off a mini arc for the two of them. If you look at other narrative mediums like literature and film, it's this kind of under-the-hood, emotion-based storytelling that differentiates a dramatically functional story from either a plot description or a plot description with some production values. It's this kind of storytelling that a surprising number of times is either non-existent or handled with a stunning poverty of imagination or artistic inspiration in Brotherhood, even when that show isn't rushing, and it's this kind of storytelling that's overflowing in 03 with some spillover even in some of that show's weakest moments. Hey guys, this was where I was going to bring up Brotherhood's version of Maria Ross's intro scene so I could show how it lacks the kind of thing I'm talking about, but something happened when my brother pulled up the relevant episode for me on Crunchyroll. When we got to the scene of Ed standing in front of the burnt remains of the military library's central branch, my brother turned to me to share a brief, jokey comment. Upon looking back at the TV, he was astonished to see Ed and Al on a car ride with Maria Ross and Brosh, who in that viewing seemed to him to appear out of thin air. You want to know why that happened? Because the scene where Ross and Brosh first meet Ed, in between the bits where my brother was paying attention, is like 5 seconds long. So no, in terms of their dramatic effect, which is what we're talking about or should be talking about here since Lunatic is responding to my comments on these characters' dramatic effectiveness, Maria Ross's intro scenes aren't more or less the same, even on a surface level.
He had me in the first half, not gonna lie, but then he hit me with the...
So no, in terms of their dramatic effect, which is what we're talking about or should be talking about here since Lunatic is responding to my comments on these characters' dramatic effectiveness.
And then I realized this man is just, well, lost right now, so let me course correct you, Etheri0n. You're lost because you once again interrupt my point to make this point. But let's just get this Neko out of the bag. While I am responding to your comments about the dramatic effectiveness of scenes like this in either version of FMA, the actual point I'm discussing moves away from this subject. Why? Because it's a counterpoint in regards to whether or not the audience could find the reason to care about what happens to Maria Ross in spite of her lacking this proper introduction, particularly based on how each series approaches slowly building her presence as the story goes forward. While I will agree and admit that their introductions aren't necessarily more or less the same in how they are presented and their dramatic effectiveness on the audience, you have to understand that my entire point is centered around the face value impact of these events, and the point I was getting at through this entire section was that the audience is given a reason in both animes to care about this character through events that happen later. So, going back to the end of your interjection statements, no, we're not talking about the dramatic effectiveness.
If you want to talk about it so badly, don't take it up with me, take it up with your mom.
By the way, I just thought about this question being raised in the meanwhile, so I'll answer it just in case. Okay, but how does the counterpoint get rid of what I'm saying about Brotherhood not really caring to focus on moments like this? The point wasn't trying to say you were wrong about that, but just that this statement of, why should I care about Maria Ross, the series didn't care to give her a proper introduction, could be explained with this. Now, is that an appropriate counter-argument in the first place? I don't know. Take that up with your mom, too.
However, we learn more about their characters through their reactions to the events they're faced with. It goes without saying, 03 gave her a much larger role. In 03, when Ed considers giving up on the Philosopher's Stone hunt, she encourages him to keep going. When Ed is at his lowest, most destructive point in that part of the story, she reaches out and helps him. By contrast, in Brotherhood, she isn't given nearly as much of a focus and isn't as integral to Ed and Al's goals, but does slap Ed, like in 03, for disobeying orders and going off on his own.
Yeah, Maria Ross does slap Ed in Brotherhood, and that would be a great moment for the two of them if they had any kind of relationship prior to this moment outside of a more or less professional one.
Hey, you know, I'm noticing the distinct lack of a point here. Like, oh, this would be a great moment for the two of them, but Brotherhood doesn't do much to establish their relationship prior to this. Like, okay, but
Firstly, I'm not listing this moment to act like it is a great moment for them in Brotherhood. I'm just listing moments she has in the main plot of Brotherhood. This is important because it all adds up to that counter-argument that you seem to really not want to play out in full for some reason. But a reminder, it's just that Maria's character is built up over the course of the story, and this is one example of that. I get if maybe you just want to point that out, but, maybe just some clarification first, not making it seem like you're trying to counter me against something I didn't even say in the first place with Etheri0n. Anyways, honestly, I could just leave this point at that, but I can't even say I agree with your sentiment. I mean, I get it, and it's entirely fair. This scene is a big moment for both of the characters in Etheri0n, but I'd argue in Brotherhood, it's not even meant to have that pre-established weight in the first place. You have to remember, Maria Ross doesn't have the same importance to Ed and Al's journey in the manga, so while before in Etheri0n we were given a couple of moments to really establish Ed and Maria's relationship, in Brotherhood in the manga, it's instead here that it's really established in the small kind of relationship they have in the first place. It's really not that big. And hey, it makes sense, because she's not terribly important to the story the same way she is in Etheri0n. And as I try to stress in minor number 7, what importance she does have is solely built around this point in the story. However, this isn't necessarily a matter of their introduction, but their role in the story.
When I said the thing about the introduction scene, I wasn't making the point that the introduction was the main problem. I was implying that Brotherhood's lack of a proper introduction is indicative of a more general lack of care Brotherhood takes when handling its characters. Whether you agree with that is another discussion, but Lunatic phrases his response in a way that makes it seem like he thinks my main problem with Maria Ross was her introduction scene, when that was just one of the problems I had with the show's approach to character.
Firstly, I know I've made this point more than enough times already, but I cannot stress the importance of letting a point play out before you start a conversation surrounding it, because the end result is that the audience continues to get hit with points like this, where you completely misunderstand what I'm getting at for face value readings of points that aren't even finished yet, and end up saying stuff that is contradicted by information stated later on, or otherwise just get slapped by information that explains the point further. It shows a very serious lack of understanding of video response when you can't even let the whole point finish. And again, I repeat because I'm concerned somebody will respond with this. There's a difference between arguing a small section of a point that may have incorrect information and arguing a point that just isn't finished being made. Now that this has been drilled into your head, let's move on to the actual point here. Essentially, Etheri0n immediately jumps to the assumption that I'm acting like this is the main point. I don't know why, because if the foundations for that main point are flawed, then I'm allowed to criticize them. You can't beyond the scope that, I'm sorry, but that's how things work around here. Just because I'm pointing to smaller things of major points doesn't mean I'm acting like that's the main point. I'm just focusing on issues in larger points, and this point reeks of serious ignorance. That being said, I find the fact that he delves into this discussion because I say this isn't a matter of their introduction, but their role in the story kind of funny, because it's based on my old misconception of what you meant by proper introduction, and I really expected Etheri0n to point this out, but, well, it's not against the main point, so he kind of just brushes us off.
Rock, paper, scissors.
And to address the point about her having many good interactions with the cast, the only interactions she has before her fake death are brief, 1 or 2 line exchanges with minor characters outside of the Elric brothers.
Firstly, I can finally get to the point where I really want to acknowledge that I really don't like the point in my original video, as it essentially just boils down to, well, you're wrong, Etheri0n, because they have screen time. Yep, anyways. I was thinking about that while scripting this, and I just thought to myself, wow, nobody's pointed that out. Not even Etheri0n. You'd think he would, but anyways, I think it's important to remember that these characters ultimately don't have a terribly crucial role in the story, and even the scenes that Etheri0n has talked about that lead to him feeling that they aren't given the time they needed, the focus of those scenes are appropriately more so on the effect this has on the surrounding characters, like how Maria's fake death ends up causing Ed to mistrust Roy in the military, with little Maria's fake death acting as a kicking off point and less of a sad scene we're supposed to feel all sorts of sadness with. While Etheri0n's point is true to an extent, he's ultimately downplaying these interactions and what they do for her character in spite of their briefness. And it's to give the audience a good feel for her character through small doses because, well, she's a seriously minor character and is treated as such. It helps that her scenes with Brosh and their interactions are more comedic and showcase the less tense side of the military in order to ease the tension of the surrounding parts of this story. That briefness of these scenes alone sounds like something that essentially debunks my statement, but I made it under the assumption that everyone understood that for what type of character she is handled effectively. I'd also like to add that by the cast, I'm mostly referring to the Elrics anyways, like, I do understand the misconception since, the cast refers to the entire group, not necessarily a handful of the characters, like the Elric brothers, which is like 2 of them, so not really a handful anyways, but, okay, I'm just gonna move on.
Rock, paper, scissors.
But we're still given ample time to get to know him, see that he's a pretty chill and likable guy, all topped off by his role in getting Maria Ross out of a mistress. We're given plenty of time to really find his character pleasant before he gets brutally paralyzed and sidelined. I understand if you don't feel enough is done to get us secure, but I think outside of your perspective, it's fair to reason that enough is done with his character. Could more be done? Of course, but that's not to say there's no reason to care about Havoc by that part of the story.
You and other people might connect to what happens in the screen time that he's given, but to say we're given plenty of time to learn about him as a character and as a person I don't think that's true. In fact, while working on this very video, I combed through all of Brotherhood's episodes leading up to the 3rd laboratory mini-arc, and out of all of Havoc's appearances, the only ones that conveyed distinct personality traits or that gave him an important role in a story event add up to 1 minute and 40 seconds. Now, if you add up the runtime of all of Havoc's appearances, regardless of what he does in them, you do get a much bigger number in 8 minutes and 56 seconds, but here's the thing. I'm being extremely generous with those numbers, considering for a good portion of the time I recorded, he wasn't even on screen, he was just in the room somewhere. When it comes to the rest of the time, do you guys want to know what he does during the rest of that time? He does things like saying, "Yoki, who's that?" and lifting a fucking tarp. To illustrate how meaningless all of these other appearances are and how generous I'm being by even mentioning them, he might as well have been a potted plant that just happened to be within the frame when the camera was pointing at a more important character. Don't act like I was baselessly saying what I did in my original video. There very clearly was a reason for my stance. The worst part is that I know, or highly suspect, that Lunatic the Game didn't go through all 18 of these episodes to back up his arguments, because if he did, he would have noticed this, and to those of my viewers who feel that what happened in the minute and 40 seconds of meaningful screen time Havoc had was enough to get them invested in his character, that's fine, but again, I didn't argue that his paralysis would have absolutely no effect on some people. I brought up Havoc and Maria Ross as examples of the cast suffering because of how ineptly Brotherhood handled its first 14 episodes, as well as to argue that if the series didn't rush the shit out of its beginning, big scenes involving those characters would have been more impactful, a point which Lunatic the Game, again, implicitly seems to agree with when you closely examine his logic.
With this section, I'm honestly getting the impression you really don't know why I'm saying any of this. Like, the point has gone completely over your head, and now I have to go grab it and throw it at you again, so here we go. The reason I said anything like this in the video in the first place is to illustrate that I felt those issues weren't really cut and dry issues as you had tried to illustrate they were. That the way the characters were handled wasn't as big of a problem as you had tried to make it seem. I will fully admit I don't like this point, but not for anything you've had to say about it. But because looking back, I definitely could have done more with it, and that's an issue that permeates throughout my entire video, just a heads up, but that's neither here nor there, so I'll save it for final thoughts. But back to the point. Essentially, the rest of your point after you're done talking about Havoc is just retreading that ground because you just can't comprehend where I was coming from. And I'd honestly be completely accepting of that if my wording was dog shit and I wasn't making myself clear, but I'm certain I was. I can't even be sassy here, I'm honestly just as confused as you are. Speaking of confused, I'm terribly confused over what you're trying to get at the very end of this section about me implicitly agreeing with your point about the impact of these characters. Like, it reeks of not understanding that there's nuance to how you feel versus how I feel. I think more could be done, but ultimately I believe Brotherhood handled it fine for the most part anyways, which is again what I was getting at. You believe Brotherhood handled it poorly and should have gone further into focusing on these characters. I'm not agreeing with your logic in particular at all. How did you come to that conclusion? Drugs? Fucking hook me up with that shit, nigga. After hearing this point, I need some too. So putting that aside though, let's tackle the rest of this section. It certainly isn't better, I can confirm that. Like, to start, you completely misunderstand what I mean by we're given plenty and ample time to know Havoc. I will give the benefit of the doubt. Like, if you look up the word plenty, the first definition states it means a large or sufficient amount or quantity. But you're overlooking the sufficient part of that definition, which if you understand that I also state we're given ample time, which is a more direct way of saying enough, then it becomes very clear I'm not saying we're given lots of time to know him, but enough time. Again, I sort of understand, but at the same time, the warning signs were literally all over the place that what you assumed I was saying and what I was actually saying were vastly different. Your suspicion that I didn't rewatch Brotherhood for this video is on the nose, though I did rewatch bits of 03 to be fair, but that was because why would I when I was already well aware that Havoc
had exactly 3 scenes that I felt were good for giving the audience the sufficient material to understand him for what role he had in the story. And by the way, those 3 scenes are him bringing food for Falman while Falman was watching Barry the Chopper, leading to a couple of exchanges between the 3 of them. Important because Havoc brings up his new girlfriend, who we later learn is lust by the end of the episode. Him proclaiming his love for big boobs in spite of being in the middle of a dangerous mission with Roy, and him helping Maria. Also, in case anyone really wants a TLDR as to why I feel this way about these characters, it's really due to the role Havoc has in Brotherhood, which in itself is pretty small. If Havoc was on the same level of importance as, say, Major Armstrong, I'd agree with Etheri0n. These are just unrelated shower thoughts I thought I'd share for those interested in where my opinion comes from, and not a, this is why Etheri0n is incorrect, by the way, because his opinion is perfectly valid, but I will explain in more detail why I took issue with this statement in a later point within this video, as it has to do with something Etheri0n states in the future. Actually, I don't know if I'm keeping that point in the video. So if I don't, that would make this part kind of pointless. Also, I might as well criticize myself some more since I'm a little bored, but another problem I have with this section in my original video, where the fuck are my examples? Like, I have some for my later points in this video, but not here. Why not? Oh, right.
Speaking of 03, a lot of people love criticizing the whole alternate universe plot point from the original series.
Maybe because it was stupid or something.
Saying it's nonsensical, and it is, but it is thematically relevant to the show, whereas an even more ridiculous scene from Brotherhood is never criticized simply because it's from Brotherhood. I'm talking about the end of Ed's fight with Pride, when he literally goes inside of the homunculus by turning himself into a Philosopher's Stone. This is really bad, and it raises a lot of questions too. Like, how the hell did he figure out that he could turn himself into a Philosopher's Stone? How the hell can he turn himself back? How come none of the sacrificed souls, like the alchemist who worked with Dr. Marco specifically, and who were transmuted into other Philosopher's Stones, tried turning themselves back after they were
Full Metal Alchemist.
This would be a really good point if I didn't think about it for like 2 minutes and then looked online for answers. Turns out, this scene makes a lot more sense than you give it credit for. Ed figured out that he was able to turn into a Philosopher's Stone during episode 41 when he was in the process of healing himself after removing a steel beam from his body. While in the painful process of doing it, he says,
"As soon as it's out of me, I'll close up the wound with alchemy."
What? Have you ever performed any kind of medical alchemy before?
Sort of. I did some research on it when I tried human transmutation. I'm gonna have to use my own life force, the same way I would use a stone. That's it! I'm a Philosopher's Stone that's powered by a single soul!
Before managing to fix his organs because of that. Since Philosopher's Stones are made up of human souls, he had likely figured out that he could use his own soul to fuel transmutation. The likely reason that Ed is probably the first person to be able to pull this off is simply because he's incredibly gifted, and one of the few alchemists to understand the composition of a Philosopher's Stone. Now, understandably, all of this is stuff that the story maybe perhaps could have built upon a little better, since Ed's brief comment is the only bit of build-up we get to something like this being possible, but if we're simply talking about how something like this even makes sense, it does. The series at least established how and why.
After I uploaded the original video, some commenters did chime in on my take on that scene, and what they wrote convinced me that Ed turning himself into the Philosopher's Stone does make sense within the logic that Brotherhood had previously established. But the part of my original criticism that's a lot less certain, and that you didn't respond to here, is the bit where I questioned how Ed transmuted himself back into a human when other alchemists used as ingredients for other Philosopher's Stones, such as Marco's assistants, weren't able to, which as far as I know, isn't explained.
Huh? The fuck do you mean I didn't respond to that criticism? I literally did!
The likely reason that Ed is probably the first person to be able to pull this off is simply because he's incredibly gifted, and one of the few alchemists to understand the composition of a Philosopher's Stone.
And even putting aside whether or not that is a good counterpoint in the first place, like, bro, it's right there. I'd give you a pass if this was a poorly worded way of putting it, but you should have been able to get the idea that me expressing that Ed is the first to do something like this is me explaining why the other scientists couldn't do it. Talk about an oversight, good lord.
Having said all that, I still have issues with this scene that justify me using it for the comparison in my original video, and I'll go into these issues later. Also, I take issue with what you say next. In the next clip, you say that I mainly offer subjective criticisms for Pride's death scene.
Thank you. Nice of you to let everyone know what I was about to say before I actually say it, even though you're gonna show my full point with, like, no changes. Like, if I explained what I was about to cover because I wasn't gonna show all the context to it, that'd be one thing, but this makes no sense by comparison.
And the scene just looks stupid. You see a naked Ed popping out of a hole and gives this ridiculous scream. Just everything about this moment, it's laughable. The way that the triumphant music plays over it, with Salim explaining what Ed just did, and the way that Kimberly, a psychopathic war criminal, just sits in the back of Salim's soul with a dopey smile on his face and says, "That means you never understood Edward Elric." I know this is supposed to be a big moment for Ed, showing how noble he is and all that, but it's conveyed in the cheesiest, dumbest way possible.
I mean, if you think it looks stupid because of all those elements, fine, but is this really an objectively awful scene? A lot of the problems you have with it, such as how goofy it looks, is really just subjective fluff.
Firstly, I want my viewers to remember my disclaimer from my original video.
I really have to ask myself what exactly you were trying to cook here with this statement. Like, as far as it's shown in this video, your disclaimer can be boiled down to, I just want to discuss problems with FMA Brotherhood, and I think we need to keep the discussion very civil. This kind of prompted me to go back and watch the segment of the original video, and well, yeah, it's essentially just that. So we have to raise this question to you now. What exactly were you trying to cook with this statement here? Your disclaimer doesn't do anything about my point, whether that be debunking or pointing out to me misunderstanding the intention of your points. I feel this point probably needed some clarification, because otherwise it feels very directionless and nonsensical.
Secondly, setting that disclaimer aside, I have a problem with using this tactic of saying, well, that's just subjective, and thinking that's enough to just dismiss everything I'm saying, because a lot of art criticism is subjective, and if you're gonna bother making a response to anyone's criticism of something, pointing that out doesn't really mean anything.
How about a good old fun fact? Funny thing, I was initially gonna stop and joke here that I got the impression Etheri0n stopped listening to me after he heard me say the word subjective. Then I realized, yeah, that's exactly what happened. He cut me off after I was, started talking about subjectivity. I have a full point here that he just doesn't listen to. Yeah, it's consistent, it's in character, but it's still fucking annoying. Anyways, like, Etheri0n would be fully correct in a vacuum, but I don't think he realizes that we're not in a vacuum. I'm in Tokyo for some reason, and he's there in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Abyss. God bless him, he deserves that shit. Look, there's a much broader context that surrounds this point, and it's not the type of broader context that should easily be missed either. You have to remember exactly what Etheri0n says in his original video that leads into his discussion about this scene, which, to TLDR it, is that this scene from Brotherhood is equally as ridiculous as the much-loathed reverse isekai sequence from 03, but doesn't get criticized because it's from Brotherhood. My statements about your attitude towards this sequence being based in subjectivity are the building blocks to a full point that you rudely interrupt about that there's more to this scene than you realize, and ultimately there's a pretty understandable reason why this scene is not criticized as you think it should be. I'm not just calling your point out because it's subjective, but because that subjectivity comes off as you pushing these statements as objective, since you don't give any clarification here that this is how you feel or anything like that. And since it's tied to those statements at the start, it's easy to come away with the impression you believe that this scene is objectively ridiculous looking. Remember, this video very much presents itself with an objective tone, so if the intent wasn't for that to be the case, then you very much failed in making it seem that way. From this point forward, it might be appropriate to start counting the amount of times Etheri0n cuts my points and argues them out of context. Let's make it a drinking game.
Rock, paper, scissors.
Even people who believe that there's no objectivity in art criticism probably believe that talking about why a scene fails to capture its intended tone is the closest thing to objectivity that art criticism can even have. Unless we're talking about plot holes, but most critics think that plot holes are much less important than dramatic impact and aesthetic values. While I did phrase my complaints in a simple and comedic way, if you think about why I responded to the scene in the way that I did, it's not difficult to come to the conclusion that I felt the scene's handling of the tone didn't match the importance of the scene in the story.
An upcoming problem that'll start to become more and more apparent as we go along with this video is that often in Etheri0n's original video, he'd say one thing, but it'd sound entirely like another thing. And so I'd argue it with that other thing in mind, only for him in this video to retroactively go, wait, no, I was saying this, and be annoyed as if he didn't word his stuff in a way that could cause confusion. And given how a couple of points after this he even briefly acknowledges how I'm not the only one who interpreted his statements in a way he didn't intend, I really do believe this isn't incidental. The last statement of this point in particular really showcases what I mean. This is hopefully the rudest thing I'm going to say in this video, so excuse me for what I'm about to say, but please do not give me that, Etheri0n. In that segment, you focus heavily on every detail that you feel adds up to a sequence of events you find utterly ridiculous. Sure, you do cap it off by saying it's supposed to be a big moment, but it's handled in the cheesiest, most cheesiest way possible. But you know what that gives the impression of? It gives off the impression you think the scene looks stupid and feels cheesy. If you were trying to get across in particular that you felt this particular scene didn't match the tone, well, you failed. I'm sorry, you didn't make that clear because you focused on the ridiculousness of the moment and only gave a brief aside that could possibly lead to someone getting that idea. But based on how everything's set up, it's easy to understand why my takeaway was something entirely different. This retroactive argumentation is probably my least favorite part of this video, somehow even more so than Etheri0n cutting up my points. I'm gonna be 100% honest, the biggest issue with my video on Etheri0n, or at least my original one, is that my wording isn't the best, and so with this video, I've been very careful to decide whether or not Etheri0n misunderstanding a point of mine is either because he didn't pay attention to it or because I didn't word it well enough. I actually cut out a page and a half from this script because I came to the realization in a particular segment that Etheri0n misunderstanding my point wasn't really his fault, since certain details of the point make it sound like I'm saying something else. I'm bringing all of this up because I need everybody to understand the difference between how Etheri0n handles poor wording versus how I've handled it in this video and will proceed to in case any more examples pop up. Often the cases where I make this argument involve situations where while the wording could have been better and more clear, it's certainly not to a point that could allow Etheri0n to misconstrue them so badly as I've tried to make clear many times. It's kind of like the Araki forgot discussion piece you often see within the JoJo fandom, with many people claiming Araki forgot an important plot point, when really it's more like he didn't, but often the plot point wasn't done in a very concrete, obvious way, but still in a way where you can understand what's happening.
Also, I should point out your other complaints is just Pride explaining what Ed just did. I mean, look, if it was super obvious what Ed was doing here, I wouldn't blame you for finding that dumb, but remember, the Ed realizing that it was possible to do this was barely established, as I've already explained. Plus, it's not like Pride's dialogue is simply him explaining what's happening, it's him being baffled that Ed could even do it in the first place.
Impossible! He's turned himself into a philosopher's stone and now he's forcing his way inside me!
On the other hand, yes, Kimblee, a psychopathic war criminal, shit talks Pride and hypes up Ed as all of this is happening. Remember, it's because while Kimblee is a psychopathic war criminal, he lives by certain rules, and seeing Pride, who considered himself above humans because he's a homunculi, try and take Ed's human body because he's in a pinch in spite of how he felt about humans, made him interfere because he saw that as Pride going against his word.
I should also add that Kimblee is not giving off a dopey smile that is an evil grin.
Yeah, I know it's an evil grin, and my problem isn't that Pride explains what Ed did, period. My problem is with how the show presents Pride's explanation. The scene intends to make Ed look clever and badass for using a homunculus's physical and spiritual makeup to his own advantage, but as you yourself say, the show didn't optimally build up the mechanism of how Ed accomplishes this, so I have a hard time buying that Ed is clever at all. In terms of dramatic buildup, it feels like the divine screenwriter planted that knowledge into Ed's brain.
Hey, if you wanted to say this just to clarify your position on the scene, you know, that's nice, that's fair, that's nice, that's all good. If you're saying this because you thought I should have known this based on your wording, even though you literally said none of this, you just said that Pride explains what Ed did, then I'm sorry, you should have said this in November 2020 when you released the original video. But if it's not the intention, cool. I'll just say this, you should probably distinguish your intentions when you try to retroactively explain your old points, because here I do wonder if you expected me to be aware of your original meaning, because it most certainly was not explained well, because again, all the stuff you brought up in this interjection was not stated at all.
This is where I'm gonna segue into tone. The way I phrase things in my original video may lead people to think that my main issues with the scene are logical problems, but I want to make it clear that it's actually the tone that's the main issue for me, as it pulled me out of the moment and possibly led me to notice the logical problems in the first place. For example, what's the tone of Kimblee's character? It's a black abyss of cruelty, with only the coldest set of ideals acting as his moral framework. What's the tone of Pride's character? It's dread, horror, the feeling of encountering something alien, otherworldly, Lovecraftian like impossibility. Lastly, what is the tone of the scene that sends these characters off? Triumphant heroism with some screw you energy mixed in. I believe that even if a character does something that's consistent with who he is, his actions can still feel at odds with the overall tone of the scene surrounding him. You can argue that it's in character for Kimblee to say something like, "That means you never understood Edward Elric," but the presentation surrounding him, especially the choice of music dominating the audio track, gives his line a much dopier, cheesier feel than it would in most other scenes involving that character, hence why I use the word dopey to describe Kimblee here. That's what I was responding to. The presentation makes it feel like Kimblee is more interested in affirming Ed's goodness.
I'm gonna get to the overall main point here in a minute or so, but I would like to acknowledge this portion. If this is to counter me mentioning that it makes sense that Kimblee would say what he was saying in the scene based on his characterization prior, well, again, you only talked about how Kimblee was a psychopathic criminal and he was hyping up Ed. It gave the impression you thought this moment was just out of character for who he was, and my statement there served to let you know that it was very much in character. Again, I'm not sure if you're bringing this up because you think I should have known this, but you can't exactly blame me for misunderstanding you when you didn't say anything like this in the original video.
Rock, paper, scissors.
This scene ultimately has a lot more than you give it credit for, and personally works much better than that scene you compared it to from 03. I can list a couple of reasons people don't complain about this scene, such as how emotionally cathartic it is, and Kimberly's unnecessarily badass send-off. By comparison, the real world is on the other end of the gate plot twist from 03 gets strangled by a myriad of issues, such as having little foreshadowing, given most if not all of it was brief references to real-world events such as witch trials and the plague, all of which came mere episodes before it happened. The fact that the plot twist is given little time to be explored, since it happens in the penultimate episode, and is given a short half an episode to be explained before Ed is sent back to his world, and the fact that it admittedly feels out of place in the more grounded reality FMA03 built. And look, I'm saying this as somebody who kinda still appreciated the sequence. I think it has too many flaws in its presentation that not be seen as a little bit weird. By comparison, Ed's transmutation into a Philosopher's Stone has the issue of not being explained well, and that's it.
Like I said in my original video, the gate plot twist in 03 is nonsensical, but having said that, I think you're slightly exaggerating some of the logical problems with it, namely how early the twist was planted or foreshadowed in the show, and you're forgetting to mention some of the virtues that the gate plot twist had that the scene of Ed turning himself into a Philosopher's Stone didn't. I think these virtues even things out between the two plot points and justify my initial comparison. Although like a lot of people I have issues with the dramatic buildup of 03 Ed entering our reality, 03 didn't only give hints right before the twist itself happened, the audience sees images of our world's history and Ed's memories of the gate all the way back in episode 29, which is just after the halfway point of the show.
No, wait, I don't think you understand. All of the brief references to world events happened towards the last few episodes before the plot twist. I wasn't saying all of the hints. I was essentially saying all of these specific ones, that being because they're much more noticeable than Ed briefly seeing flashes of our world history, because not only is the sequence incredibly brief, audience members can very easily just unconsciously assume that's a stylistic choice done, not an actual plot point. So even if I had been trying to argue that all of the hints came right before the episode happened, I'd still hardly be exaggerating when arguing how out of nowhere the twist is. I'd just be slightly incorrect as to how the series threw in the hints.
Now, I personally don't think hints like this can fully justify a twist of that scale from a dramatic standpoint, but I still think the abruptness of the twist itself is somewhat justified given the purpose of it within 03 Ed's arc and within the thematic arcs of 03 as a whole, because what the gate twist lacks in dramatic buildup, it more than makes up for in thematic buildup. There's a reason Ed travels to our world and not to some metaphysical realm sealed within the gate or to some other fantasy sci-fi setting the writers could have conjured up for the finale. 03 is about the conflict between fantasy and reality, between childhood and adulthood, between the ideal and the concrete, between our personal dreams and the needs of the flesh and blood people around us.
I dreamed to get everything back the way it was. But once you have it, what will you do with your life? The pleasure of a dream is that it's a fantasy. If it happens, it was never a dream.
The show explores these conflicts primarily through Ed's stubborn belief in equivalent exchange, and through his refusal to accept its possible falsehood. When you keep all of this in mind, it makes thematic sense that at the climax of Ed and Dante's argument about equivalent exchange in episode 49, which is really an argument about the fairness of the quote-unquote real world, Ed goes through the gate to our world, the actual real world, and not only is he stranded in the middle of World War I, often considered the embodiment of bleak disillusionment, but he's also literally stranded in reality itself. This is the thematic justification for the suddenness of this reveal. It's a sudden, brutal reality check. Ed is out of the dream world and then the literal, real world, out of the realm of his dreams and ideals, his beliefs, and his ambitions, and in the realm of the ugly price of all of those things. He discovers that the deaths that take place in our world, the real world, fuel the transmutations of his world, the dream world. This is the dark foundational truth of all truths, or it seems like that at first. On the other hand, Brotherhood Ed transmuting himself into a Philosopher's Stone to defeat Pride, whether or not you think that scene is effective overall, has limited thematic significance beyond that moment. Considering everything I just said, the pros and cons of both of these developments even out a lot more than Lunatic the game says they do.
So with all of this in mind now, I think it's worth reminding the audience how exactly this conversation ended up in the place it is now, where Etheri0n has to write a college essay expressing the thematic brilliance of the reverse isekai sequence, which, by the way, good essay, would actually make a very solid individual video, but its placement in this video only serves to show a lack of understanding as to what I was trying to say by pointing out this sequence's myriad of flaws, which is that ultimately, it's understandable why a lot of people most certainly have it out for the reverse isekai sequence, while the scene from Brotherhood that Etheri0n attempts to tear apart has very few serious objective flaws that could give it the same amount of vitriol. The one flaw I point out being the lack of clarification as to how exactly Ed was able to do any of that. The purpose of this section is to contrast their flaws, and how the 03 scene seems to have a couple more, at least from a, yeah, this is something that everyone can agree is a problem standpoint, because I discussed earlier, your issues with the scene's tone are significantly less agreeable, hence why this isn't a common criticism it gets. But with this segment, I wasn't trying to say the scene had no positives the same way I felt Brotherhood's scene had positives in the way the scene was portrayed. In fact, while I am discussing the scene's flaws, I don't say the scene is bad, but instead say, I think it has way too many flaws in its presentation to not be seen as a little weird. So you trying to even me out by pointing out the positives, well, kinda speaking to the choir here. Keen listeners may have heard me admit to kind of appreciating the sequence even if I called it stupid, and that's because I think there are things to like about the scene. For me, all of it has to do with me being super into World War era history, so even if I thought the scene was poorly handled, I still couldn't help but fanboy, just a little. But I chose not to discuss them because, well, that wasn't necessary. I wasn't trying to say it had no good, but that it had flaws, and it makes sense that some people can't look past them since they're so glaring. Also, I really don't understand the necessity of adding that the Brotherhood scene had little thematic elements to this discussion, because this segment wasn't about themes, and which one had better themes, so shoving this in here only makes it feel like you're arguing more things I didn't say. Alternatively, I wonder if the idea is that you think my intentions with my point is to argue the positives in the Brotherhood scene outweigh the negatives, which wasn't the point, just that I felt you sold the scene horribly short based on how you handled this discussion, and that these elements are part of the reasons I imagine people attached to the scene, and didn't really think too much about some of its flaws. Anyways, I'ma move on and talk about your college essay about the scene's virtues, because while I do actually quite like it, the idea that its thematic richness more than makes up for its problem and dramatic buildup is, well, not true. At least, not entirely. It's worth understanding that even with all of this in mind and how it all adds into Ed's arc, it doesn't really take away the flaws it has in trying to build that point. The lack of build-up, its suddenness, and the lack of exploration other than, yeah, this world exists, anyways, back to the real world you go, Ed, don't magically go away because, oh well, it all makes sense with its themes in mind, because ultimately themes add flavor to the text, but if there are areas where the text just isn't the greatest, then the flavor can only do so much. If that flavor is enough to make the bad taste go away for much of its audience, that's fine, but don't act like that'll go for everyone, because, well, tastes depend on the person. As such, even if the scene's intent to surprise the audience as a way to be a harsh reality check for Ed is intentional, it still is a plotline shoved in and pulled out right before the end of the series. I think you need to understand that for many people, themes can only go as far as their execution. And while I won't act like this scene is indefensibly horrible in its execution, it's only fair that certain audience members find it hard to move past the lack of build-up for such a huge plot twist that barely has room to breathe amongst the already jam-packed climax of the story. In a way, it all comes together as a double-edged sword, the themes on one end and the flaws those themes brought upon the story on another. And as someone who has serious mixed feelings on the scene, I think everyone needs to understand that these two sides coexist, and whether or not one side saves or ruins the scene really is a case of taste, so the suggestion that it more than makes up for the lack of dramatic buildup is not as true as you act like it is.
Also, I just realized we have like 17 more minutes of this video, which means somehow Etheri0n managed to stretch the last 2.5 minutes of my original video into 17 minutes. Who is letting this man cook?
Specifically, let's look at the flashback Riza has of a conversation with Mustang during the Ishvalan War. What is the intended mood of the scene, and how does the show try to convey that? Well, the flashback delves into Riza's conflicting feelings about passing on her father's alchemy research to Roy, now that Roy's basically used that knowledge to murder countless Ishvalan innocents. So the intended emotion here is heavy, it's haunting, it's full of sadness and regret. How does the scene convey that sadness? Riza kneels in front of a dead child's grave while literal violins play in the musical track as she describes to Roy exactly how she's feeling. There's nothing to pick apart in the scene, because the point of it is practically spelled out for you.
The overall point you're trying to illustrate during the last third of the video is that Brotherhood handles its more mature moments poorly by not being subtle about what it's trying to say, and while I fully understand the criticism when it comes to how characters sometimes explain stuff to each other, leaving no room for the audience to come to conclusions themselves, though I will say I disagree with the idea of this being an inherent issue, as I argue it's down to execution.
I never said lack of subtlety was inherently bad. In fact, I even said something along the lines of what you say here.
The problem with this episode, with the early parts of the show in general, and really with a lot of moments after the show supposedly gets great, lies with these cliché choices in execution. I honestly think that the real reason Brotherhood's first leg feels rushed is that its execution is paper thin.
As you can see, I'm not exclusively talking about the first 14 episodes of Brotherhood in this clip, I'm talking about Brotherhood's execution and a lot of its runtime well after that point too.
Etheri0n, I never said it was the lack of subtlety that was an issue. I was actually talking about the characters over-explaining thingamajig. See, when I was talking, I was kind of treating the over-explaining stuff as kind of a subsector of this discussion, which is why right before I say I disagreed with this as an inherent issue, I pointed to the over-explaining thing because that in particular was what I felt wasn't an inherent issue. Now, by all means, I guess you could say that they fall under the same umbrella, but nonetheless, that was the only thing in particular I felt was an inherent issue. To be fair, I don't think lack of subtlety is an inherent issue either, but I didn't say that because, well, I didn't feel the need to, or because alternatively, I knew you didn't suggest it was. Huh, fancy that. Also, what's this about you not exclusively talking about the first 14 episodes of Brotherhood in the clip you showed, but the series as a whole? Like, I get your point is built on this foundation. By the way, no, I didn't show this in the original video because it wasn't necessary for my whole point, but Etheri0n forwards a section talking about the overly explaining thing and taking Brotherhood down a peg by expressing that he's using this particular scene as an example because it's from the quote-unquote most beloved stretch of the anime to quell a possible claim that he's only picking apart the show's arguably weakest stretch, the first 14 or so episodes. But you make it seem like I tried to argue this was exclusive to those episodes when I surely didn't say or act like it was. In fact, once you finish this point, you'll notice a distinct lack of me countering your point, just disagreeing with it, but focusing on a completely different issue that's more down to the point's presentation. I honestly get the impression that you're projecting the assumption I'm saying that on you, or you're just reaffirming your statements about why you targeted the scene even though it is entirely unnecessary, unless you're talking to Casper the friendly short-term memory affected ghost or something like that. I have to say I think your handling of the argument feels poorly put out there, with this section being the best example as to why. Because see, you start off complaining about Brotherhood's handling of Riza venting to Roy after the Ishvalan genocide by complaining about the literal violins that play while Riza buries a dead child, basically spelling out the tone of the scene. But these don't inherently take away from a scene's presentation. I mean, it's a scene that's supposed to be sad, so of course it will be presented with a sad mood through music and imagery.
I think it's obvious from the clip you played that my problem with the Hawkeye scene isn't so much that it uses sad imagery and music for a sad scene period, as it is the specific kind of sad imagery and music that it uses on top of a monologue that describes every molecule of Riza's emotional state. I mean, if my problem was only the use of sad music and imagery to convey a sad tone for a scene, I would dislike almost every work of art on the face of the planet, including O3.
I'm going to be incredibly truthful when I say I'm pretty sure Etheri0n absolutely did not listen to a word I just said. I mean, while I feel this isn't a particularly standout example of a point that you need to hear in full to really understand, I will say I wonder if him not being aware of my closing statements towards the end of this interjection that I understand that the overall point that Brotherhood is not subtle and often spends time elaborating characters' feelings or their situations to the audience, but this is the last thing that should have been said here because all it does is make the rest of this argument look worse, is why he completely fumbles this segment like a motherfucker, because he really doesn't understand where I'm coming from. And on one hand, I understand why, because my point is coming from a place of misunderstanding what he's saying. So since he knows what he actually meant to say, he's questioning why I'd say this in the first place without putting two and two together, that fundamentally some steps were skipped over in making this point less oddly worded. To clarify what my point is, in minor number 7, I'm questioning the point about literal violence and kneeling in front of a dead child's grave, which gave me the impression that the scene being visibly, outwardly sad through music and imagery was a bad thing and part of the lack of subtlety issue. Meanwhile, Etheri0n's actual point is that Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood's manner of execution for these things is bad, but this isn't very well expressed based on how it's all set up. Instead of his point being presented as a case of the execution of these elements being bad, it feels more like an element of the execution being bad. Because of that, I wasn't completely confused, and my point is essentially me saying this makes your point sound worse, because as you acknowledge, if you thought sad music and imagery made something bad, you wouldn't enjoy any media. That's why it's a problem your point sounds like that. And as you spoiled before this interjection, why I point to O3 doing those things, because I found it baffling that this would be a problem for you, as if the anime you're comparing Brotherhood to throughout this entire video was any fucking different. Of course, when you actually know the point, it's understandable how my point would be completely confusing. But it's just the lack of thought given to, okay, maybe I kind of put these words together in a weird way that could be kind of misleading. The fact that you don't notice this, that's kind of weird. By the way, I do wonder if anyone will point out how I'm essentially debunking my first video with points like this where I acknowledge that I misunderstood but call out poor wording. And the answer's easy. If minor number 7 has flaws, then I have no problem in acknowledging or pointing them out, but I think it's worth acknowledging when those problems came from misunderstandings to blame on taking Brotherhood down a peg, which I came to realize while scripting this video suffered from an issue of sometimes not being the most clear with its points. So even if the actual point Etheri0n wants to make is good, if people can misunderstand it due to terrible wording choices, then I think it's absolutely necessary to point that out. Unfortunately, because Etheri0n completely misunderstands the background behind my statements, he goes on a couple of tangents regarding the examples I use in regards to O3, having a similar thing going on with its music and imagery, not understanding why I was using those examples in the first place. I'm pointing this out because I have no interest in discussing most of these, as it boiled down to me essentially just repeating what I say here about him misunderstanding my words. Consequently, we'll be skipping the majority of these next 17 or so minutes. Well, actually that's a good thing personally, given how long we've been going already. Unfortunately, there's still stuff to go through, so bleh.
Also, while I have huge problems with the non-verbal elements of this scene's presentation, my biggest problem here, and the problem that pushes these other elements over the top, is Hawkeye's monologue. Not because I think monologues are intrinsically bad, I just think that there's an art to them, one that Brotherhood largely doesn't understand.
Cool, I know. I was only mentioning this tidbit about the violence and whatever because I thought it was questionable. Stop assuming I'm trying to act like smaller bits of the point is your main argument, because I'm not.
Anyways, notice how Lunatic is singling out one element of the Nina Corp scene from O3. This is a problem not only because I listed every aspect of the Hawkeye scene in my original video, but also because if you want to compare the quality of two different scenes from two different shows, you need to see the whole picture of each, not just a piece here and there in isolation. You need to see how all of the pieces work together, so let's be more thorough, break down these two scenes, and consider how all of their components work together. As I said in the original video, the intended emotion of the Hawkeye scene is a bunch of things. It's heavy, haunting sadness, regret, confusion for having given Roy the tools he'd used to commit genocide, as well as conflicting feelings about destroying the results of her father's research forever. But Brotherhood conveys most of these emotions through on-the-nose text. Here's a question. When you remove Hawkeye's monologue, what emotion comes through the non-verbal elements here? I'd argue that it's sadness, and that's mainly it. Listen to this track. Viewers, answer this question honestly. If this was the first time you heard that track, without having watched Brotherhood beforehand, would you have strongly felt the other emotions that Riza must have been feeling in that moment? Now listen to this track from Nina's Corp scene in O3 and ask yourself the same question. What do you get from that track? Do you pick up on just one emotion? Because it seems to me that multiple emotions, maybe like horror, confusion, regret, a sense of failure, and not only sadness, are built into the DNA of the track itself. This music almost feels like it was ripped from one of Wagner's operas, especially in how it uses dissonance to convey intensity and conflicting emotions, and not one dominating tone. In other words, the music here feels multi-dimensional, with its stringed instruments more strongly conveying despair, inner turmoil, and suffering than simple sadness, which is why I don't have a problem with the stringed instruments used here, whereas the violin score from Brotherhood is primarily a tone indicator for sadness. I'd argue it's nothing beyond that. If I'm being honest, the track even reminds me of the meme violin song from SpongeBob, but with slightly rearranged notes, which is why I comedically singled out how lazy the instrument choice was there. As I said in my joke, Brotherhood was using literal violins to convey a one-dimensional type of sadness. This is the most cliched instrument choice for that specific emotion. Yes, significantly more cliched than pianos, because if you ask someone which instrument they'd use to make music parodying pity or plain sadness, they'd probably say the violin or some other stringed instrument before they'd say the piano.
Thanks, I hate it significantly more now. Your understanding of my point was already bad, but then you threw this segment in here and now you combined your misunderstanding with just a horrendous analysis of this scene's music, on top of not understanding that if I want to call attention to a specific element carried over in both scenes, you can't just try and force me to look at every detail. That's not how examples work. Jesus fucking Christ. But anyways, let's talk about your analysis of the music, because really, it's shamefully shallow, almost seeming like a purposeful dismissal of the instrumentation and stylization and how the music is utilized in the scene. You boil it down to just violins, and since violins are heavily associated with sadness, it's lazy and doesn't properly convey the tone. Look, I really don't want to sit here and analyze fucking music, but I might as well since we're here now. Yes, the music choice is a simple violin, something you see as generic and just a symbol indicator of sadness. But there's a couple of things you absolutely sleep on. The violin isn't just being played, but it's being played calmly, quietly. Instead of being very loud and outwardly, it's muted, restrained, and it's absolutely fitting for how Reza presents herself in the scene. She's conflicted, frustrated, sad, but she doesn't blow up at Roy or even cry. She just contemplates quietly everything they've gone through and vents that to Roy. Say what you will about her detailing every bit of her emotional state to Roy, but the music encapsulates how she's expressing her emotions and flows with the scene more than effectively. It's not just sad violins on MP3, it goes deeper than you seem to want to acknowledge. Plus, the medley is based on the main theme of the show, the Full Metal Alchemist, a motif that plays during significant and triumphant moments, and here it's being used to represent the characters at their lowest. Like, come on, you could at least try to analyze this scene with any sort of thought. Also, we really need to acknowledge how a lot of this discussion about the music would have been awfully nice to have in the original video, because by just saying literal violins, well, what does that expression convey? That violins are bad? That using violins is bad? A much better way of putting it would have been calling them generic or bland or anything along those lines. All this really does is prove my point that you seriously put this example out poorly in the OG video. On the bright side, I get to skip some more since the majority of my points would just be me saying, "You misunderstood my point again and again and again." Yay. Though I guess there was the whole me apparently misremembering the whole sequence when Ed's at the gate with Envy, because I describe it as if the only thing that happens is Ed crying knowing he's being sent to the United Kingdom, which, you know, is a fate worse than death. I mean, knowing he may never see the people he cares about again, when the scene's actually a lot more than that, since it's also his discussion with Envy before they depart to the real world to find Hohenheim. Plus, Ed doesn't even cry like I claimed he did until right when the piece ends, but I don't get why you're assuming I'm either misrepresenting or remembering the scene. Like, does it not occur to you that I'm only talking about that last part of the scene? The part where Ed's alone and realizing, oh, fuck, bro, I gotta fight Nazis now? Like, yeah, that's not the whole sequence there, but I'm looking at specific moments where sad music and imagery are used to effectively deliver the feels here. And I get you don't understand why, but yeah, forget it, I'm skipping.
Rock, paper, scissors.
One moment that, to my surprise, is really beloved, Envy's tearful confession that he's actually jealous of humans. Now, I personally think this reveal fails to hit emotionally. There's no reason to feel anything resembling sympathy to Envy here, because up until this point, he's consistently portrayed as a sadistic sociopath.
Gee, it's almost like that isn't the point of the scene. The scene is presented with a sad tone to it, but I feel it represents the pathetic nature of how Envy goes out. Stripped of all their power, and Ed's pity only serving to come off as him talking down to the bastard from Envy's perspective. He just goes out like a fucking bitch.
I don't even know anymore, man. I mean, it's possible that what he says applies to the manga version of this scene. Okay, so you yourself say that this scene has a sad tone and that it's about how pitiful Envy is at this moment. G-boy whiz, isn't pity like another word for something? I just can't remember. Oh yeah.
Oh my god, stop letting this man cook, he's burning the house down! Etheri0n, the definition of synonymous means of a word or phrase having the same, or, and hold on to your seat when you hear this bit, nearly the same meaning as another word or phrase in the same language. This is important because they don't mean the exact same thing. Fancy that. Pity implies a more general sense of sadness at somebody else's situation, whereas sympathy implies a more personal sense of understanding of that situation. Funny thing, while I was already aware of this difference in semantics, hence why I used the word in the first place, I looked around the web for better sources on this, and one of them happens to be titled, "People who confuse these three simple words have very low emotional intelligence." The third word being empathy, by the way. I'm not gonna make any assumptions about the type of guy you are. I mean, I don't even know you, but I'm just gonna let that sit there. And you know what? I think I've had enough of this. I don't care enough to sit through the rest of this video. I believe my original video mostly ended at this Envy point. So after this, I doubt there's much significant stuff for me to cover. I really hope nobody finishes this video and comes away with this sense that I only made it because I cannot take criticism. I can't, very much so. It kinda comes with this hobby I've been doing for nearly 7 years now. And it's why I hope the response to this video isn't me being entirely dismissed because, oh well, they responded back, that means only one thing, they cannot take criticism. I stressed in my commentary on myself that that mentality is really dumb. But then again, I have no evidence to suggest that happened aside from a weird gut feeling. But for real though, I appreciate that you responded to my video, but ultimately the end result is very easily one of my least favorite videos I've ever decided to commentate on. And I really think the video wouldn't have run into this fate if one thing was changed. You stopped and thought about my points. Because how many times did I interject just to point out that you cut off my point or misunderstood me? There's too many points where you seem to hear my point in a vacuum, not understanding the larger context I'm arguing it within. And even when I can certainly give benefit of the doubt that some of my original points weren't worded very well, I still find 10 plus more instances of you just misunderstanding me for no clear reason. This video ran circles around my mental health, which if you're looking for a culprit on why this video response took so long to release, the ignoring college, other projects, and depression, then yeah, that. I do sort of want to give you some benefit of the doubt though, because response videos aren't exactly the easiest thing in the world to do, but I really don't get the impression you tried it all here. I do understand that perhaps you were committed to other more interesting projects, but nonetheless, I recommend if you ever decide to do anything like this again, just stop and think out the points you're making against the points you want to argue. That's really it. I have nothing else to add, so that's enough from me. This video's tired me out, so I'm going to London. Ciao.